The Ultramarines, originally known as the Warborn, were the 13th Legion of the original 20 Space Marine legions. This loyalist legion was later reorganized and divided into chapters according to the Codex Astartes. Their primarch is Rupert Guilliman, whose leadership, not to mention his authorship of the Codex Astartes, were instrumental in humanity's survival following the Horus Heresy. Because their primarch wrote the text that defines a Space Marine chapter, the Ultramarines follow this codex strictly, their only deviation being the recent formation of the Tyrannic War Veterans, comprised entirely of veterans of battles with the Tyranids. The Ultramarines are possibly the most important imperial organization on the Eastern Fringe. Early history. The Ultramarines, in the days before being reunited with their primarch, were originally known as XIII Legion. The Legion was created towards the end of the Unification Wars, developed from a gene seed that was noted to be absent of mutation and with a high adaptability. The original recruits were drawn from the subequatorial Maglev clans of Pan-Pokro, the war families of the Saragan Enclave, the Medafric Hive oligarchy and the anthropophagic tribes of the Caucasus Wastes. As varied in culture and origin as these groups were, they all had one factor in common: their violent and often bitter resistance to the later stages of unification, a resistance broken ultimately in each case not by negotiated surrender but near annihilation, with in some situations little remaining, save interned refugees and orphan populations left by the savage conflicts which had brought these people to heel. The Legion was created at such a late stage in the war that they have no recorded combat operations on Terra, instead being used for the first time for the liberation of the solar system. During the early Great Crusade, the Legion became known as the Warborn, referring to their disparate Terran origins that were all nonetheless forged through war. They were one of the 3 Space Marine legions to take part in the first pacification of Luna, the first pitched battle of the Great Crusade. Another major early campaign of the Legion was putting down the Osiris Rebellion. By 833 M30, the strength of the Legion had risen to 33,000, but its morale and pride was harmed as a result of heavy losses during the Osiris Rebellion. The youth of Rupert Guilliman. Like the other primarchs, Rupert Guilliman was taken as an infant by the powers of chaos, and removed to a far-flung world in an effort to prevent the coming age of the Imperium. The infant Guilliman's capsule fell on Macragge, where it was discovered by a group of noblemen hunting in the forest. Inside the capsule they found a child, surrounded by a glowing aura. He was taken back to Conair, one of the 2 consuls who governed Macragge, who adopted the infant as his son and named him Rupert. Rupert was a prodigy, growing fast in both body and intellect. By age 10, he had mastered every subject the wisest men of Macragge could teach him, and his insights into matters of history, philosophy, and science often stunned his elders. However, his greatest talents were as a military leader. These talents led his father to give him command of an expeditionary force to Illyrium, a mountainous region in the far north of Macragge, whose wild inhabitants had terrorized the civilized regions for years and successfully resisted every previous military campaign. Not only did Rupert fight a brilliant campaign, but he also earned the respect of the wild men who never again threatened the more civilized parts of Macragge. However, on his return to the capital, Rupert found the city in chaos, as his father's co-consul, Gal Lan, had attempted a coup. Gal Lan led a faction of Macragge's nobility who were used to enjoying their wealth and position at the expense of armies of slaves, and resented Conair's legislation favoring the common people, among whom he was immensely popular. Approaching the city, Rupert and his soldiers saw the city in chaos, being sacked by mobs of Galen's men, while the consul house was under siege. Rupert left his men to restore order to the city, while he rushed to the consul house and lifted the siege, only to find his father close to death, surrounded by his loyal bodyguards. He had been mortally wounded by an assassin in Galen's employ, and with his dying breath, told Rupert who was responsible. Rupert swiftly crushed the rebellion and, amid a wave of popular relief, assumed the title of sole consul of Macragge. He set about punishing the treachery and carrying out his father's vision. Gal Lan and his co-conspirators were executed, and their lands and wealth were redistributed to the people. With superhuman energy, Rupert reorganized Macrag's entire social structure, creating a meritocracy where office and honors were given to the hard-working, rather than the wealthy and influential. Under his leadership, Macrag prospered as it never had before. The arrival of the Emperor. While Rupert was prosecuting his war against the Illyrian rebels, the Emperor of Mankind and his armies had reached the neighboring planet of Ispander. It was there that the Emperor heard stories of the extraordinary son of Consul Conair, and realized that he had found one of the lost Primarchs. However, due to an unexpected warp storm, his ship was thrown far off course, and by the time it reached Macrag, Rupert had been ruling for almost 5 years. When the Emperor reached Macrag, he found a world that was self-sufficient, prosperous, with a strong and well-equipped military, and engaging in trade with nearby systems. Impressed, the Emperor assigned command of the Ultramarines Legion to Guilliman, and relocated the Legion's forward base to Macrag. The Great Crusade. With the exception of the Lunar Wolves, no Legion conquered as many worlds, or conquered worlds as fast, or left conquered worlds in such good state during the Great Crusade, as the Ultramarines. Guilliman restored the Legion's morale and prestige following difficulties in the Osiris Rebellion, and later took revenge on the Osirian Cybrids at the Battle of the Eurydice Terminal. Whenever Guilliman liberated a world, he would not move on until he had set up a self-sufficient defense system, and left advisors behind to create industry, set up trade routes with the rest of the Imperium, and form a government whose first concern would always be the well-being of the people. The success of the Ultramarines may be thanks to their diverse but stable gene seed. In them was found a mixture of aggression and restraint, discipline and determination, which rendered them supremely suited for joint task force operations and cross-theater warfare. As Ultramar grew into a small stellar empire in its own right, Guilliman created a supremely efficient military machine, centered around Macrag, that provided the Ultramarines with a steady flow of new recruits. Between this factor, and the minimal casualties suffered as a result of Guilliman's tactical genius, the Ultramarines soon became the largest of all the Space Marine legions, so large, in fact, that an organizational unit above the company was required. The Ultramarines were thus organized into chapters, numbering at least 25 just before the Battle of Calth. Rumors speculate that the size of the Ultramarines could only have been possible due to the fates of the two unknown legions. At the time of the Horus Heresy, it is estimated that the Ultramarines Legion numbered around 250,000 Space Marines. The Horus Heresy. Before Horus declared his treachery against the Emperor, he ordered the Ultramarines Legion to assemble for war in the Viridian system in Segmentum Tempestus, far to the galactic south, claiming that the system was under attack by an Orc invasion force from the Gaslark Empire. Ultramar was close enough for an assault against Viridian, so Guilliman ordered his legion to assemble in the Calth system. The Battle of Calth. As Guilliman and his fleets arrived at Calth, they knew something was wrong, because none of their astropaths could get messages through the warp, and the storms were interfering with the navigation of their ships. They were blocked from the rest of the Imperium. It was at this moment that the traitor forces of the Word-Bearers Legion attacked, rendering the Ultramarines unable to participate in much of the Battle of Terror. Simultaneously, the Word-Bearers under Lorga, as well as the World Eaters, attempted to cut off the rest of Ultramar from the Greater Imperium in the Shadow Crusade. The battle at Calth, though ultimately a victory for Guilliman, was devastating for the Ultramarines. Nearly 120,000 of the Legion Space Marine were lost, and another 28,000 rendered combat incapable. This represented almost 60% of the Legion's pre-heresy strength of 250,000. Imperium Secundus. After the formation of the Ruined Storm, Guilliman feared Terra lost and used the Ultramarines and the realm of Macrag to create a new contingency empire known as Imperium Secundus. Imperium Secundus faced a major test in the Battle of Sotha, where the Ultramarines and their fellow Astartes allies that had gathered fought off a force of Night Lords. Ultimately, after a number of disasters, clashes between Guilliman, Sanguinius, and Lionel Johnson, and a vision by Sanguinius that the emperor was alive, Imperium Secundus was abolished. The three Primarchs led their legions in an attempt to breach the ruined storm and reach Terra. Through an arduous journey, they eventually reached Davin, the nexus of the ruined storm, and engaged a vast demonic host. After the battle and the destruction of Davin, a way to Terra through the ruined storm was clear. However, in their way stood many enemy blockades, as Horus had foreseen this route. Sanguinius and the Blood Angels raced directly for Terra, as was their destiny, while Guilliman and Lion L. Johnson led the Ultramarines and Dark Angels in diversionary attacks against Horus' blockade. After the death of the ruined storm, Guilliman gathered whatever forces he could and made haste for Terra. In his path lay a large defensive chain of hundreds of worlds manned by the Iron Warriors. In a series of bitter engagements, both sides took heavy losses, but the Loyalists were able to maintain a steady advance. The Great Scouring. Guilliman was ultimately able to set course for Terra, destroying Chaos reinforcements along the way, but arrived after Horus had already been defeated, and the traitor legion scattered. Because of this, the Ultramarines were one of the few legions at full strength in the aftermath of the heresy. Thus, Guilliman and his Ultramarines bore much of the burden of holding the Imperium together against aliens and Chaos forces. During this time, the Ultramarines recruited heavily from Ultramar and eventually counted for over half of the Loyalist Marines. Apart from leading his Ultramarines in countless battles across the galaxy, Guilliman also accepted an extraordinary appointment as Lord Commander of the Imperium. With the Emperor crippled and Lord Malcador dead, it fell to Guilliman to reorganize the Council of Terra into a ruling body capable of running the Imperium without their sovereign. Around a decade after the heresy ended, the Imperium finally reached a point of stability. Creation of the Codex Astartes. After the Horus heresy, Rupert Guilliman set himself to create the Codex Astartes, which would define the tactics and organization of all Space Marines, from battlefield strategies to squad markings. Most important of these changes was the division of the legions into 1,000-strong chapters. One of the chapters would retain the heraldry of the original legion, but the others would be given a new name and symbol. In doing so, Guilliman hoped to divide the power of the Space Marines to ensure that a civil war on the scale of the heresy could never occur again. This, however, caused dissension among the remaining Primarchs. Rogel Doran, Vulcan, and Leman Russ opposed the splitting of their legions, while Guilliman himself was supported by Jagatai Khan and Korax. Neither side was willing to relent, and the controversy grew more intense, with Rogel Doran calling Guilliman a coward for not having participated in the Siege of Terra, and Guilliman accusing Doran of being a rebel for his refusal to follow the Codex. The situation threatened to bring the Imperium into another civil war. When the Imperial Fist strike cruiser, Terrible Angel, was fired upon by the Imperial Navy, Doran finally relented and agreed to split his legion. Duel on Escrador. On Escrador Alfarius, the Alpha Legion's Primarch, was apparently taken by surprise when Guilliman departed from his own strictures and led a surprise assault by his elite units on the Alpha Legion headquarters. In the resulting personal combat between Alfarius and Guilliman, it is believed that Alfarius was killed. The Alpha Legion responded, not by breaking and fleeing as Guilliman expected, but by turning on the Ultramarine detachment and harrying them so mercilessly that by the time they had returned to the main body of the Ultramarine force, their casualties were almost total. The Ultramarines were driven from the planet in the subsequent battle. The Iron Cage. Shortly after the heresy, the Imperial Fists laid siege to the Iron Warrior's greatest construct, the Eternal Fortress. The fortress consisted of over 20 square miles of bunkers, towers, minefields, trenches, razor wire, tank traps, redoubts, and a system of complex underground tunnels in the shape of an 8-pointed star. At the center was a massive bunker intended to serve as a decoy and of no value whatsoever. Guilliman advised his brother Doran against the siege, but Doran was embittered at having lost the debate over the Codex to Guilliman, and wished to vent his anger and frustration on his most bitter of rivals. Hundreds of Imperial fists littered the grounds of the fortress before Guilliman and the Ultramarine relief force arrived, 3 weeks and 6 days later. The Imperial fists had fought without sleep and had long run out of ammunition before the Ultramarines found them. Perturbo, unable to hold against the 2 legions, made his final ploy, stopping the Imperial fists to recover over 400 of their dead and the gene seed they contained. Perturbo's victory was spoiled because of the intervention of the Ultramarines. However, his sacrifice was great enough for him to be raised to Demon Prince status. The Salar. Ultimately, Guilliman's rule over the Imperium would come to an end in the Battle of the Salar. There, he faced his traitorous brother Fulgrim in a fateful duel. Guilliman was mortally wounded during the battle and put into stasis thereafter by the Ultramarines, where he would remain for the next 10,000 years. Gene Seed. The gene seed of the Ultramarines is highly regarded as one of the most stable, with only a 10% chance of mutation. Ultramarines' gene seed perfectly utilizes every organ and implant with low risk of mutation or defect. Moreover, there is little observed degeneration of gene seed over time, making Ultramarines' gene seed as perfect today as it was in the time of the Horus Heresy. The gene seed is noted, however, for having a predisposed increase in aggression and a tendency towards cohesion and adaptation of hierarchy. As the largest Space Marine Legion, the Ultramarines' gene seed was subsequently used to create most second founding chapters and today are still the most overrepresented origin of gene seed among the Adeptus Astartes chapters. The Space Marine chapters that split from the Ultramarines Legion are amongst the most celebrated Space Marine forces, especially those near the realm of Ultramar. Most of these chapters closely follow the doctrines in the Codex Astartes. The Ultramarine successors of the second founding, known as the Firstborn or Primogenitors, maintain a far closer bond with the Ultramarines than many other chapters, with many having their homeworlds in the Ultima Segmentum. But even the most distant chapters send representatives to the Fortress of Hero to confer with the Lord Macragge to coordinate the war across the entire Imperium. Many Space Marines of these chapters aspire to take a pilgrimage to the shrine of the Primarch. Culture. The Ultramarines pride themselves on their strict adherence to the Codex Astartes, and view themselves as an exemplar for all other Space Marine chapters. They believe, not without cause, that their Primarch's teachings have molded the Adeptus Astartes, and the Imperium as a whole, in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, and that it is their responsibility to continue to serve as this paragon. For this reason they are viewed as straight-laced and somewhat elitist by their brother chapters, from the more anarchic Space Wolves to even their own successor chapters, such as the Mortifactors. The chapter treats deviation from the Codex as a crime tantamount to heresy, punishable by a death oath, exile from the chapter on a suicidal mission to combat the forces of chaos inside the Eye of Terror. To the Ultramarines, the Codex is more than a set of rules, it represents discipline and respect for order, the key virtues that separate the Ultramarines and their brethren from the traitor legions. Disobeying the Codex, even for a noble cause, is simply the first step towards the belief that the ends justify the means, and from there to total anarchy. The Ultramarines are also strongly influenced by their unique history as stewards of Ultramar and its human population. Guilliman founded a culture based on striving for the common good, and the Ultramarines are proud to uphold these beliefs. Where other Space Marines are aloof, and sometimes contemptuous of the Imperium's lesser mortals, most Ultramarines are used to working closely with ordinary people in Ultramar, and regard any human life, no matter how seemingly insignificant, as sacred and worthy of protection. They are also harshly intolerant when they encounter less altruistic behavior, greed, selfishness, corruption, on other Imperial worlds. During the invasion of Ultramar in 999-M41, Inquisitor Namire Suzaku of the Ordo Malleus noted that the people of Calth regarded her and her entourage with curiosity, but no visible apprehension. She remarked that it was the first world in the Imperium she had ever visited where people felt they had nothing to hide from the Inquisition. After the start of the Indomitus Crusade, some of the Ultramarines Primaris began to call the common, non-Primaris, Space Marines, as firstborn, though Sicarius, for example, considered it overly reductive and colloquial. Home sector. The Ultramarines are unique in that, unlike their fellow chapters, they control an entire subsector of space, rather than a single planet. Collectively, these systems are known as the 500 Worlds of Ultramar, with Macragge as its capital. Though the realm itself is divided into smaller sectors which are each in turn ruled by tetrarchs that are appointed by Rupert Guilliman himself. While the number of colonized worlds in this domain numbers in the hundreds, some of the most well-known planets of Ultramar include Macragge, as the capital of Ultramar; Calth, the cavern world and main shipyard of Ultramar; Espander, the cardinal world, and many more. Their origins to the Ultramarines, and many still revere Rupert Guilliman as their creator. As well as a bolt gun, many Ultramarines carry a sword known as a gladius. The Ultramarines Honor Guard wield formidable close combat weapons known as the Axes of Ultramar. During the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy, the Ultramarines were a much larger legion commanded by Rupert Guilliman. Beneath him were chapter masters who led approximately 10,000 warriors and a segment of the legion fleet. Each chapter was in turn divided into 10 companies of 1,000 under the command of a captain. As the Paragon Codex chapter, the Ultramarines are divided into 10 companies of 100 Marines, as prescribed by the Codex Astartes. Each company captain is a hero of the Ultramarines, many of whom are also masters of the chapter, in charge of a particular aspect of the chapter's logistics. Ultramarines Honor Company. Because the Ultramarines Legion played little part in fighting the War Master's forces during the Horus Heresy, a number of Ultramarines Primogenitors chapters contributed individual squads to a standing force near the Eye of Terror known as the Ultramarines Honor Company. Those that took this duty in the Cadian Gate were changed by the unknowable terrors. Many of these Space Marines went on to serve in the Death Watch and were some of the most dedicated of their chapter's warriors. It is unknown whether this company was either destroyed or simply made defunct after the collapse of the Cadian Gate and subsequent cicatrix mail dictum. Fulminata. The Fulminata is a newly formed demi-company of the Ultramarines formed entirely from Primaris Space Marines. Recruitment. The Ultramarines continue the tradition, begun by Guilliman, of recruiting from the worlds of Ultramar. There is rarely a shortage of volunteer aspirants, since the Ultramarines are revered throughout the realm, and many families can boast of having sent several generations of their sons to serve the chapter. No recruitment rites and trials of the Ultramarines are specifically known. However, they are known to utilize two types of general trials known as the exposure trial and the challenge trial. In the exposure trial, the aspirant must simply go out into the wilderness and survive for a set period of time. While simple in its nature, it is extremely difficult as the trial is often set on death worlds, desert worlds, or ice worlds. Other times a feral world savage might be inserted into the middle of a hive city. The trial is often impossible to complete, with a subject succumbing but being recovered and healed by apothecaries should he deemed worthy. The Ultramarines make extensive use of the exposure trial. In fact, they are known to cast newborn infants into the wilderness in order to test their resilience. The other trial, the challenge trial, sees the aspirant engage in a duel with a full battle brother. None of the challengers are expected to defeat the brother. The trial is measured in degrees of failure. Very occasionally, an aspirant does manage to beat the battle brother, and when this happens it is not uncommon for the individual to go on to become a legendary hero of the chapter. Aspirants who survive training at one of the barrack institutions in Ultramar, human youths, are inducted into the chapter as scouts, as the Codex dictates, before completing their transformation into full Space Marines. Thank you for listening to this entry from the Warhammer 40,000 Lexicanum.